Okay, let's continue working through Thorsten J. Pattberg's Shengren. We're on to the introductory page 7. And here we have two quotes from very prominent thinkers, Western thinkers and writers. One from Edmund Husserl in the Vienna lecture. He writes, "There is something unique here in Europe that is recognized in us by all other human groups too. Something that becomes a motive for them to Europeanize themselves, even in their unbroken will, to spiritual self-preservation, whereas we, if we understand ourselves properly, would never Indianize ourselves, for example." The next quote comes from Hermann Hesse from Siddhartha. "We cannot and we must not become Chinese. And at heart, we also don't want to. We must not search ideal or higher meanings of life in China or in any other thing of the past. Otherwise, we lose ourselves and adhere to a fetish." So what does that bring to mind? One could argue that the age-old adage that one should be strong to themselves and persevere and find the authentic understanding of one's own identity. However, I think there is something much more of an issue here that goes beyond a question of self-preservation. And I think it's very interesting that Pattberg uses these two quotes, and we'll see throughout this book as we continue, it's a question of directions in terms of thinking, ideas, and influence. So another introductory section here, this time on Chinese terms, starting again with another quote. "I am master of this college, and what I know not is not knowledge." This is from A.N. Whitehead. And so here we are provocated into this idea of what is knowledge and who is the master of such knowledges. Let's continue. "The Roman Empire is narrated with pride and pomp, and Latin, its lingua franca, having superseded the Hebrew and Greek lexicons, perpetuates all European languages to this day. Yet the Mongols had their empire too, and so did Han and the Manchu, the Turks, Persians, the Arabs, and the Hindu. Their civilizations towered large and different, and their languages just as rich and original to humankind. Yet why are we so reluctant, even in this age of globalization, to adopt Asian key terminologies? One obvious reason seems to be that of power and dominance. Those who own its language control knowledge. The Jewish world order ended when Saint Jerome translated the Hebrew and Greek Bible into Latin. Martin Luther, the Protestant reformer, translated the Latin Bible into German, hence the march of the Germanophone Empire. The translation rationale has served European expansionists well for 1,000 years, but is it ethical, scientific, or even legal in the 21st century to translate Asia's social-cultural originality into convenient European words? Why is it that, say, US brand names like Coca-Cola and Google enjoy greater legal protection than the entire intellectual output of India and China of the past 3,000 years? One way to protect words is to limit translation. Ayatollahs and imams are not philosophers. Philosophers are not Buddhas or bodhisattvas. Buddhas are neither Shengren or Rishis. Western categories are often unsuitable for non-Western creations. Calling a Hesang, rabbi, ulama, or jinzi, priest, seems unnecessary in the face of our digital age, where we can easily dig the originals if we wanted to, that is. In the following chapters, this author is going to illustrate pars pro toto, a part that stands for the whole, the case for Shengren of the Confucian tradition. The Shengren is the most important concept in East Asian thought, only perhaps comparable to the philosophers in Europe. Yet Shengren are not philosophers, nor are they biblical saints, prophets, folkloric sages, or Lutheran appointees. The Shengren is just this, Shengren. Unfortunately, the entire Confucian tradition of Ruxue, including the Daxue, an instruction manual on how to become a Jinzi, often loosely translated as Chinese gentleman, has been obscured by European categories. Few Chinese terms have survived the translational onslaught during the age of European imperialism. Some commentators have tried to arbitrate my case. They argue that English language has already adopted enough Asian loanwords such as Japanese samurai, ninja, and sumo, or Sanskrit yoga, guru, and pundit. To which I reply, yes, but that was just the beginning. Compared to what Asian hemisphere still holds on offer for us, the number of foreign loanwords remains suspiciously low, and in the case of Chinese words, almost insignificant. This is going to change. So that's quite a provocation and a reminder. In my experience, the direction and the treatment is so low that when we receive just the slightest praise or interest, for everybody, it seems like such a big deal. And just to prove the point, it's interesting that we think, perhaps, sure, many people have heard of Confucianism. However, let's look at the Chinese word for this. The Chinese word for Confucius is actually Kongzi. So Kongzi, why does it get translated to Confucius, which is a Latin translation and understanding? Furthermore, Confucianism is not just one branch of philosophy. And Confucian itself is actually called Ruxue, which is the study of scholars. And what does it study? It's not study about Confucius himself. It's some of the branches of development of thought that Confucius has laid out and that has continued, of which concludes ethics, morality, hierarchy and social harmony, education and self-cultivation, governance and meritocracy. And this got me thinking, particularly, let's say, in Europe, generally the immigration policies is more towards integration. One might think that in the United States and Canada, perhaps, that it promotes multiculturalism. So let's look at both of them. For multiculturalism, the upsides, one could argue that it incorporates pluralism, respect for difference. But what are the negatives? There's a potential threat for fragmentation, tension and conflict, and also perception of favoritism. So if we have a look at Canada or the United States, we could very quickly just notice, even if they say we celebrate difference, we want inclusivity. But what kind of inclusivity? Who gets included and who are not included? What kind of culture is acceptable and what kind is not? This is very much the case when it comes to when we think about the myth of the model minority. Why is it that Asians, for example, in America, are only accepted if we become docile, emasculated, and serve the ruling elite to not rock the boat, so to speak? Now, on the other hand, in Europe, one could say that, oh, well, there's a different policy. It's integration. They insist on assimilation. This idea that when in Rome or when you visit another person's house. And of course, on a knee-jerk reaction, we can think, is that the case when Europeans, white people, go to other regions of the world in the process of colonization? Where was this respect when the colonialists arrived on the shores of Australia or the United States? And the same thing continues on today. You could see innumerous examples of Westerners arriving in Asia and behaving worse than they behave back at home, let alone an attempt of integration. But let's not throw it all away. Let's examine integration. Integration The benefit is perhaps that it brings social cohesion and that there's a respect for the host culture. But the downsides are marginalization, racism, of course, and it's a question of a one-sided adaptation. So, with regards to Homo sapiens, and when we research that in terms of how Homo sapiens interact with one another, has been found that Homo sapiens have exceptionally high understanding of the theory of mind and social accounting. What does that mean? It means that if I do you good, you will notice that. And I will also keep an account of like, hey, I did this person a favor. And the next time we meet, that the other person will respect, hey, I remember that you did this nice thing for me, and I will reciprocate. And this is how coalitions build. This is how social cohesion builds. This is how groups can come together and become stronger than the individual. Now, if we remember history in terms of development, that Homo sapiens differ from Neanderthals. And one of the greater differences was not that the Homo sapiens were stronger physically. It was because Homo sapiens understood and practiced more social interactivity. They were less individualistic. They were less interested in violence and domination. And what's interesting here, even in the false understanding of development, eugenics will have you believe in evolution. And racists will say, well, let's look at the people who are more, quote unquote, evolved because they have less hair. And you can see this with a lot of the races and how that comes out psychosomatically. I've noticed cases of white people that are so afraid to have body hair in the wrong parts. And they will attack themselves because they are afraid that they are not as evolved. Interestingly enough, when we started to do genetic testing, turns out that the general European genetics actually revealed to have more Neanderthal genes than the other parts of the world. So these are all the little parts in which is at stake when we think about why or how does different cultures interact? Why are there deficits? What are the different power dynamics that happens between the different cultures? So let's think about these questions. Why are there so little loan words from the Chinese to the West? Why is it that a person or study in a field such as Kongzi has to be translated into a Latinized word, Confucius, that is so far from the original? What could happen to the Western sense of self if there was actually more reciprocity? How does inferiority complex look like in a world of increased globalization as data transfers are happening at a profound speed that has never existed before? What does this mean to the fragility of white supremacy? How does it illuminate our conception of white supremacy? Now, as a parallel, again, this book is much more focused on the Chinese language in conjunction with German and, of course, English culture and philosophy. But the same can be examined in parallel with the Arab influences and Islamic influences. Today we see genocide unfolding, and we can examine and ask ourselves, why is it that certain language or words or name, what does that invoke in us in terms of our sentiments and feelings? Where does our feelings come from? When do we and how do we examine those feelings, which in essence is really to dig deep into the epistemology of our thought?